Pokemon is by far the most recognizable entity within media. Everyone of our generation knows it, even if they've never played any of the games or collected any of the trading cards. I would even wager that your parents or grandparents know about Pokemon, even if it's just because of the dummies that got on the news when Pokemon Go was all the hype. And it should come as no surprise that Pokemon is the highest grossing media franchise in the world, and comfortably at that, where Pokemon is estimated to have earned over $100 billion since its inception in '96. The number 2 on the list, Hello Kitty, which came out 20 years before Pokemon, only grosses $84 billion, and something like Mickey Mouse, that came out nearly 100 years ago, sits at number 4 at $80 billion. Safe to say, the Pokemon company knows how to get that back. However, this video isn't about the company's earnings, but more so about how they do so with their video games, which accounts for 19% of their total earnings. Because let's be honest, on the surface, it always looks like Game Freak, the company who makes the Pokemon games, are always behind the curve, clueless on what they're doing, and quite frankly, out of touch. Clearly making nearly $20 billion over 30 years time, where 6 out of the 10 best-selling Pokemon games are of the 3D modern era, proves otherwise. Lacking graphics, the game feeling rushed, the lack of post-game and even general game content, not deploying enough patches to fix issues with the game, yearly releases, paid DLC, games going downhill since the older titles, they're too easy now, and not communicating with the community, just to name a few of the oftenly brought up complaints of the Pokemon community about Game Freak. But how many of these complaints actually hold any weight when 6 out of the 10 best-selling Pokemon games come from the time period these people refer to? I think it's time we get to the bottom of this. So, let's talk about it. I think for the inception of the major critiques towards Game Freak, we need to go back to 2013. Ever since the release of the Generation 6 Pokemon games, X and Y, the Pokemon community became divided about the direction Game Freak decided to take with their video games. A big group loved the switch to 3D and were really happy about it, where another group didn't really like it because they felt that Game Freak made better 2D titles than 3D ones. I think that the graphic style of a game always comes down to personal preference, and I think that the old games have their charm, but the new 3D style is something I dreamed of as a kid and always wanted to see implemented into the main series ever since I played Pokemon XD, Gale of Darkness on the GameCube. But graphics can't be the reason why a big part of a community became upset with the developers. And you're right, there were more complaints about these titles, and most of them actually carried over into future titles as well. One of the main arguments being made is that the games have a rushed development cycle because Game Freak has to release a new title every single year, and rush meaning that they came out before they were supposed to. Which isn't something you can prove unless someone from Game Freak steps forward and makes a statement about it. Which actually, they have. And their statement is pretty much, we are not even trying to release a yearly Pokemon title, we are under no pressure to do so, we just do it. And the funny part about this is that according to most complaining Pokemon players, the yearly release cycle is the reason these games are lackluster, and they claim it is actually a recent trend, pretty much since X and Y. But is it? Well, if you call the release of Yellow in '98 recent, then yes, it is a recent trend. Pokemon only has missed 4 years of main series Pokemon games since Yellow, 2001, 5, 7 and 15. But they also released 2 games in 2004, the Generation 1 remakes and Pokemon Emerald. So, it hasn't really been a recent trend. But of course, these 3D titles do take more resources to develop, so maybe an every other yearly cycle would be better, right? However, Game Freak doesn't just have one team working on the game, but they have 3. So they are on a 3-year cycle, which is very average for finishing a game. So yes, an extra game would always be great, but then again they should also be able to finish these games in the timeframes given, especially because Pokemon isn't vastly different from the previous versions. And even the term rushed is thrown around so lousily nowadays, because I feel like every game that releases in a state that people aren't satisfied with is being called rushed. Where of course there is some truth to that statement, there are levels to it. A game like Cyberpunk 2077 that released with this many glitches and bugs, yeah, probably rushed, even if they announced it 8 years in advance. But a Pokemon game that maybe has a few small glitches here and there and functions properly everywhere else, is that rushed? Because people would argue that pretty much every game since X and Y feels that way, because they are not satisfied with the content they are getting. It could also be that the game is just not great, in your opinion, or your expectations are too high, because old games were better, right? And that is one of the main arguments being brought up in favor of this statement. Look at the older titles, they had way better post games than we do have now, and they're bringing up post games as a clear difference, because let's be honest, all Pokemon games have been the same since Red and Blue. You pretty much battle the gyms, fight the evil team, catch a legendary Pokemon, yeet the Elite Four and the champion, and you're done. So let's see if all the post games are actually better than the new ones, and I think it's fair we start with arguably the games with the best post game there's ever been, the Generation 2 games. Silver, Gold and Crystal and their respective remakes Heart Gold and Soul Silver, because their post-game was Kanto, the first ever region, where you could battle all the gym leaders with juiced up teams and explore the first region all over again. Which, to be honest, was quite impressive for the time, especially because they struggled to fit the Generation 1 games on the cartridges, which was the same technology as Gold, Silver and Crystal, and they managed to fit both games, in a way, on the same type of cartridges. However, I'm afraid we will never see something like that again, due to endgame syndrome. So how about most modern post games? The majority of them only have some sort of battle tower, a bit of a post game questline that takes about an hour or two to complete, some extra areas open up for you to explore, and some legendary encounters, some more creatively done than others. But that also counts for Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald in a way, and Generations 4, Diamond, Pearl and Platinum, which are seen as some of the best games in the franchise. So where's the difference between those games and the new ones, when those same people argue that Pokemon games never change from the usual main game formula? Pretty much, besides the Generation 2 games and maybe Black and White 2, most post games aren't really that special. Plus, you could also argue that the DLC we get nowadays could be seen as a form of post game. I don't, however, but it does lead me into something that could explain the lack of post game in modern titles. Remember when I brought up the term endgame syndrome? Let me throw out another stat for you. Only 15% of all gamers see the endgame credits, and games with assumed younger audiences, like Pokemon, are estimated to only have a 10% completion rate. Unfortunately, there are no stats for the 90s and early 2000s, but they are estimated to be more towards a 25 to 35% rate compared to now. So a game like Gold and Silver having such an elaborate post-game, regardless of the age group that plays these games, makes a lot of sense. The topic of endgame syndrome goes deeper than these stats and deserves an entire video in the future, but one of the main reasons for this phenomenon is the availability of choice. Why would you play Pokemon over X game when X game is probably free? So it's important for a company like Game Freak to release a game that has content that the majority of their player base will interact with, then focus on post-game content. Because if the content this group plays is enjoyable to them, these people will give positive reviews and more people will buy their games. Because at the end of the day, it's all about sales and player numbers and less about what Jimmy on Reddit thinks about it. Let's take it back to a more concrete argument that is being made about modern Pokemon games, and I know what you're thinking. Chev, you have played the modern games. You have seen the lack of performance and lacking graphics, especially when you compare to modern Zelda games like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. How can you claim that these games aren't rushed? But yet again, there's more than meets the eye. It is no secret that with the release of Scarlet and Violet, a fully open world Pokemon game with only 2 load zones, the main city and Area 0, came a lot of performance tips on the Switch. Keyword, the Switch. Because people ported the game to PC and didn't change a thing. Just see it as copying the file of the cartridge and booting it up on your PC, and it went like butter. It was smooth and had no issues. So is it a Game Freak issue or a Switch issue? Both in my opinion. A Switch issue because it just can't handle what Game Freak has created. Which gets me to the Game Freak part. They're developing for the Switch, so it should function on the Switch, not their development PCs. Game Freak should have dialed down their ideas or created more load zones to make the game run more smoothly, but they executed a vision that they had with these games, and the vision is there. It is just bottlenecked by a console that has a graphics chip similar to high-end tablets from 2015. And I wish I was exaggerating. And to the Zelda argument, well, Zelda doesn't have Pokemon with unique behaviors roaming around in groups and patterns. Not to undermine the amazing work the Zelda team has done, but there is a difference there. The issue with Game Freak, however, lays deeper. Way deeper in my opinion. Game Freak doesn't understand the inner workings of modern gaming. Kind of. Them making nearly $20 billion in 27 years shows that they are quite dialed in on the business side of things. Even them switching from third versions like Yellow, Emerald and Platinum to DLCs seemed to be a great move. Sword and Shield are the second best selling games in the franchise's history, only beaten by Red, Blue and Green. And Scarlet and Violet on the other hand is set to beat out Gold and Silver in the number 3 spot later this year, where a big contributing factor are the DLC drops. However, they might be dialed into the business side of things. They lost the phone when it comes to communicating with their community. But why would they? Why would they even listen to us when they are clearly being successful with their business practices? And when I just argued for the last however many minutes that most complaints about the games are essentially not true. Well, it comes down to the way they communicate with their community. Well, the lack thereof, to be honest. I would argue almost all gaming franchises nowadays have some sort of community management team or someone that keeps an eye out on what people are saying, whether that's feedback on the game itself, interacting with the community on a more human level, or catching bug reports. Especially the latter one is most used by most companies because millions of people playing the game in their own way will be just as viable as a good QA testing team when it comes to catching bugs within their games. Yet Game Freak only seems to fix the real game-breaking issues and ignore the smaller ones. It feels like they don't attempt to fix what is broken, besides the initial few things. It's not the 90s anymore, where you didn't have the ability to fix your game. It's 2023, and you have all the resources to locate the bug, squash the bug, and implement the fix. And to be honest, it's part of the inner workings of a modern game. Yes, it became more complex to develop a game. The time crunch might have increased, but you also have the tools to do something about your shortcomings after release, which is expected from people who drop a premium price on these games. It's fine that a project the scale of Pokémon on a console like the Switch releases with issues, but show at least some sort of care for fixing them, because many of the smaller bugs, even typos and stuff, never really get fixed. And even ignoring some of the best feedback from the community, things like the ability to get a toggle to turn off and on the XP share, to make the game harder for the ones who want it, or simply bringing back the difficulty setting introduced in Black and White 2, or the habit of them introducing a quality of life feature in one game, like mass releasing Pokemon, and removing the feature in the next, or the recent outcry for some sort of sparkle or sound indication for people with visual impairments who want to shiny hunt, like myself, that struggle seeing the smaller / less obvious shiny Pokemon. These are all features that have been in games prior that are quality of life and something that should remain, but it's ignored by Game Freak. And yes, I can see the comments of bring back Mega Evolution. That is a gameplay feature I would love to see back, but I can understand them not doing so they can introduce a new selling point each game. One better than the other of course, but these quality of life features should always remain and be standard. What to say about all the amazing fan projects that get made and taken down by Game Freak? Sure, I get it. People are illegally using their assets, but they are not making money with it. And even if they are, it's not tens of thousands. There's obviously an argument to be made that they are stealing from Game Freak. But come on, this keeps your community alive on another level. Speaking of ROM hackers, most of them are adults, just like the Pokemon players. Sure, Pokemon is a kid's game, but the data suggests otherwise, and it makes sense for a game that has been out for nearly 30 years. Their player base has matured. There are multiple sources that suggest that the majority of the Pokemon fanbase is over 18. Nintendo source briefings, Pokemon Go player data, mainline Pokemon player surveys, and a change in age group demographics buying games between Diamond and Pearl and Black and White. Sure, wanting to aim at a younger audience is fine, especially looking at the future and wanting the franchise to exist for longer, but maybe start thinking of using this data and giving the older players some more content that fits them as well, like the earlier mentioned difficulty setting. You know, I might be all wrong in my analysis. Maybe there's something to do with cultural differences between Japanese and Western business culture, where communication within the gaming space isn't as important in the Japanese market as it is in the Western market. Yet again, there are enough Japanese-based titles who do communicate, and there's also a lot of Western titles who do not communicate. But I'm someone who likes to base his arguments on studies and facts, and there isn't much solid evidence that suggests that it is or isn't a cultural difference. The only certainty is that both Western and Japanese companies do develop their games in different ways due to cultural differences, which is amazing and makes gaming such an incredible diverse space. But with globalization and both Western and Japanese game companies learning from each other, it's just very sad to see Game Freak being so out of touch. Because even the people who complain about Pokemon, the ones I don't agree with, they do care. They want Pokemon to be the best versions of the games that they could be. The talent is clearly there, the business savviness is there, but because they are so dialed out, they're missing so many opportunities to make these good games, great games. I hope you guys did enjoy this video, and keep in mind, this is just my opinion based off facts that I found. If you want any of the sources, you can find them in the description down below, and check out the video you see on screen. And don't forget to subscribe as well before you click that video, because there's videos every single week on Saturday.